All right, welcome to Science Fiction Reads. We're back for another episode of going over a best of from the Ballantine's Classic Library of Science Fiction. And as always, I'm joined by Ira at SF Words of Wonder and Richard at Vintage SF. And at this point, we've gone through, this is number 8. So we're just over like a third of the way through. We've read a decent chunk into this series. And as always, we usually have like an icebreaker question. And so I was thinking about how many we've read and how many authors we've been introduced to. And I thought, kind of, what are your thoughts so far on who we've read and the content of the stories kind of thing? Like, do these seem like candidates for a best of collection? Because I think we're all decently well read in this kind of era. So are these kind of the names that come to your mind sort of thing as best of quality, like the top tier authors? And what was my second question to that? Kind of, there's 21 books in this series, or 23, depending on how you count it. I was curious who you might think of as being deserving of having had their name put to this series, a best of somebody else kind of thing. And one further question. Of what we've read, if you had to be in one of these authors' worlds, who would you go with? And if you have a particular story, what story would you be a part of? Richard, did you want to start?
Sure. Boy, let's see if I can remember all the questions. I remember the second one where you were talking about what do you think of the scope of the authors that we've had here? I think that it's been amazing because there was many authors here that I really hadn't read very much from, or nothing from them. And so it really exposed me to more authors than I had seen before. Now, because these are written in the 1970s, the stories that they focus on are mostly from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, and maybe a little bit into the 60s. So when it comes to what authors were not represented here, we got to remember there's a lot of contemporaries in the 60s and 70s that really probably shouldn't have a best of, like a Le Guin, or others. The ones that I thought of potentially that could have been in there might have been an Alfred Bester, a Clifford D. Simak, and one that I think is a wild card that a lot of people don't think of for science fiction is Richard Matheson, who I think his stories are spectacular when it comes to short stories. Most people know him as the author of many of the stories on the TV series The Twilight Zone. He worked together with Rod Serling. So I think I've answered two of those questions. Just the scope and the new authors that are brought to me, and so many classic stories that are out there, realizing so many things that you think potentially are new in movies or stories were out there already in the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah.
And what world would I like to go in? I think that the author that I enjoyed most in the wacky worlds he created was Frederick Brown.
Yeah.
But I don't think I'd want to live in any of those worlds. The world
That
that
depends.
the world I found very fascinating, though, was Lee Brackett and her stories of the planet Venus. And there's one in particular that's underwater that is just I can vividly see some of the colors and some of the imagery of it. And I don't think I usually go to a sword and planet type fiction very often, but I think it would be a fascinating Venus to visit.
Yeah. And, a ton of her stories all take place in that world. So lots of stuff going on. Ira?
All right, so I guess like when it's a best of, you maybe get your hopes up a little too much. There's going to be some probably not great stories in here, but it probably had to do with licensing and whatnot. And there's always some good ones in every collection we've read so far. So I think it's great. And I think that one of the points of this was to dig deep into some of those golden age writers that were writing in the pulps. They really didn't write that many novels, or some of them did, but they'd kind of started to fall into obscurity a little bit. And so I was thinking about that, and I did think of Alfred Bester. I think he would be a good one because I have read quite a few of his short stories, and they're fantastic. But one that I thought of, I haven't read anything from this author yet. Margaret St. Clair.
Mm.
I think she was a golden age writer. From what I have heard, she writes amazing short stories. She's fallen into obscurity. You can't even really find her books very much. She's pretty much out of print. So I think she could have been a really good candidate to bring forth, and do something with there. So, and then as far as which world, I also went with Frederick Brown, and there was one story in particular, because I want to be kind of the main character in a way. It was a story called Letter to a Phoenix, and it was the guy who got affected by radiation, and he was awake for 46 years, and then he was asleep for 23 years, and he was 180,000 years old. So that's kind of my dream, to live 180,000 years old. Although in the story, he had massive anxiety. Every time he went to sleep for 23 years, he thought someone was going to come around and kill him or something. So
Yeah.
yeah.
See,
But Frederick Brown created quite a interesting, fun kind of world in a lot of his stories.
Yeah. That reminded me of, I can't remember the author now, but it was the opposite story. The guy who was kind of living back in time or something. He was traveling into prehistory slowly. I can't remember which author that was, but that would be a cool character to be as well, although kind of terrifying. Yeah, my opinion was kind of the same. A lot of these authors were new to me. Maybe I'd heard of them, but not much. And I've consistently been blown away by the quality of the stories and just the strength of a short story. I've read plenty of short stories, but nowhere near as many from 30s, 40s, 50s. And it's kind of really become my new thing. I'm really interested in these. And yeah, I would not have thought I would come away from each book as satisfied, I guess, as I have been. And it still seems like in a lot of the afterwards or the forwards, they're talking about how these authors are kind of becoming obscure, and that's why they deserve these collections. And I feel like some of these people are once again becoming obscure, like Raymond Galoon, who I don't think I'd even heard of until I came across the best of. So yeah, I've just been surprised, and I think obviously they knew what they were doing with their selections of these authors. And then when I started thinking about somebody who could have been selected but wasn't, my first thought was Larry Niven, but he came a little too far down the road. He was still in his, the beginnings of his career. But then I think I had the perfect selection, and that is James H. Smits. Writing in the, I think he had a couple in the 40s and a lot in the 50s, and then he was writing in the 60s. And he pretty much only wrote short stories. He's got a couple novels. And I've almost read, everything of his now. So I would have liked to see a best of James H. Smits. This is from Nesfa Press, but it doesn't have as many as, one of these Del Rey Ballantine books would have. These things are loaded.
Mm-hmm.
Although I'm very thankful Nesfa Press came out with something, because it's an awesome book and publisher. And Richard stole my fantasy world and author. I would like to go to the Sword and Sorcery world of Lee Brackett. I was thinking Mars, for the massive ancient history. In all these hidden corners, there's still something going on or something to be found. And then if I could make it to Venus, there's a whole new world full of mysteries, as well as that. I don't know if it was underwater, if it was a gaseous ocean, and they were in that. I think that's what it was.
You're right.
So yeah, really, really cool world building, and just the way she writes her stories. It's not the happiest world, but it would be fun to inhabit and explore. Yeah. But we're here to talk about The Best of Kuttner, who I have been looking forward to reading for such a long time. And the introduction was from Ray Bradbury, he had a really funny moment where he said he got great advice from Kuttner, which was to shut up and just stop telling people about your ideas and just write them. I thought that was funny. Although I did think it was odd. At no point did he mention C.L. Moore, who, is not just his wife, who was also an author, but collaborated on, practically everything they wrote while they were together. I thought that was kind of odd, but it was still an interesting and a good intro. It's just sad.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah.
I did find that really weird. And
Yeah.
I know that the rights to the stories came through her. She was still alive. She's executor to his stories, by the way, well, you might be talking about, he passed away fairly early. And
he was 42.
Yeah. And so there's a number of stories in here that are actually credited to both of them.
I think
or even to
3 or 4.
Yeah, or even a pseudonym of Lewis Paget for the first story in particular. And yeah, it seemed glaringly
very strange
that this was missing this credit towards her. I almost wondered if she asked Ray not to mention her and just to leave it to Kuttner, because we do have a best of C.L. Moore here in the package as well.
Yeah, that was my thoughts.
Yeah. And you'd think she would have maybe written the afterword.
Yeah, exactly.
She was still alive.
Yeah.
So I feel like, maybe she had just kind of moved on, because it was years later. She wasn't writing either after he passed away. I don't think she wrote much at all.
That's another sad thing. When he passed away, she hung up her science fiction career, and that was it for both of them.
Yeah, I thought that was really sad.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember if she wrote the foreword for Brackett or Hamilton or somebody. I know they wrote the foreword or the afterword for each other, but I'm sure she wrote something for one of these. But that introduction by Bradbury is the only Bradbury I've ever read.
Oh, really?
I don't think I've read no Bradbury yet. Probably
another one I thought could have been included here. I mean, there's some obvious people who are not, the big three, Asimov and Heinlein and Clark, A.E. Van Vogt. And there's some big guys that obviously aren't in here for whatever reason, which I actually applaud. I like having the more, for me, obscure people potentially. Even, PKD wasn't that big at that moment. He really became famous in the 80s. So, yeah, sorry.
I guess there's something, there's something to that, these, maybe I've been looking at it wrong. They're not necessarily the pillars of the genre, but they're people who were around at defining moments. A lot of them from the same era, the 40s and the 50s.
And I think a lot of their works were falling out of print and people were forgetting about them, where the big three and Bradbury and even Bester stayed in print continuously. So I think that was kind of the point of Ballantine's doing this, which is really awesome.
Yeah. And again, you never know, some stories that couldn't get the rights or some other publisher had already recently done something. There was, I don't remember if I saw this in the forward or online, but Kuttner actually wrote for a little while like a little fanzine called Sweetness and Light, which I found on the internet. I found 2 conflicting things. There's either 2 issues or 5, but he was a co-editor with a few other people, and one of those people was someone I've only ever heard of once, which was Arthur Barnes. And one of these stories was co-written with Kuttner. So I guess just a buddy of his. They had a fanzine together for a while. And if you look it up, there's some really funny illustrations and stuff throughout it. And Bradbury had a story in the first issue, kind of thing. But I don't really have much to say about Kuttner's life, other than I did notice only 3 or 4 of those stories were not co-written with C.L. Moore.
Yeah, and the only other thing I would say is I really want to read some of his early horror stuff he did.
The Rat story, right? His first published
Yeah.
story sounds really cool.
Yeah.
And he has one famous novel that's in print still. It's called Fury, and you can find
Yes.
that still out there.
Yeah, I've read that and it's really good. It has parts of some of these stories in there about mutated humans, and
Did you say you read it?
I've read it, yeah.
I haven't.
And is there not a prequel novel to that?
Not that I know of.
I think there is, actually.
There might be.
I'll
I
have
might
to
have
do some
missed
fact
it.
checking after and let you know. I'm sure there is, because I'm sure I have it. I probably look like such a fool because I'm wrong, but
Someone will let us know in the comments.
I will say my impression of his stories was not exactly what I was expecting, but a lot of humor.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the author with the most stories so far that feel like Twilight Zone-ish. And I know one of the stories was made into an episode, or at least heavily influenced.
Yeah, I would agree.
Were you aware of that, Richard? Because I haven't seen a lot of Twilight Zone.
There was one story towards the end of the collection. I think there's a total of 17 stories in here. And yeah, one of them was, I think it's called What You Need, about going into a store and getting exactly what you need. Maybe we'll talk about that story coming up. But I believe that was the inspiration for a Twilight Zone episode, but it played out very differently, and from what I remember.
When I came across that in my research, I was not surprised that he had influenced an episode. Because there's a lot of either twist endings or just, something not right in this person's life that's disturbing. So usually what we do is we go around probably twice. We each talk about a particular favorite. Do we want to start with Ira and then Richard and then I'll give one?
Sure.
All right.
So there was a few that I just absolutely loved, and I think when they get into the groove, because I'll talk about them together, I think most of the ones that I like, they were co-written. But once if they're connecting and they're right, they're some of the best short stories, I think. And they I don't even want to say age well. They're just still very readable, and it has nothing to do with politics or what's going on. They're just really cool stories at their heart, and then the rest of them are good. But when you have such great stories in the mix, the other ones seem to be a little lesser to me than they probably would have. But that's kind of just a quick overall impression. But I want to talk about the story Absalom, written in 1946. And this is a story about the evolution of humanity going from Homo sapiens to Homo superior. And we have a father who had kind of made one of the intermediary steps. He was considered a genius, and his father before him was. And his son is now the next level of genius. And he is kind of struggling with this, and he's trying to kind of hold his son back because his son wants to expand his mind and learn more, and he wants to go to this school, this specialized school in a different part of the country. And he's just constantly saying, like, I don't think you're ready for this. Kids don't really know what's going on. Trust me, I went through this. And in the story, there's another kind of supervisor of one of these schools, or these creches, I think they call them. And he's like the opposite. He's saying, like, I was supposed to take care of these kids, but they're so smart, they're taking care of me now. And you get like the complete opposite take on something like this. And the story goes on from there. It's a pretty short one. I really enjoyed it. And it made me think of something that I heard of a couple years ago called juvenoia. I don't know if you've ever heard this term.
No.
And it's like, it's the idea that every generation has this kind of, like, they look back at the previous generation, or they look to the next generation, and they're saying, like, they don't understand what we went through, and you know, the world is so different, but you can follow it back, and it's like that as every generation goes. It's something that you should really get over. So it was like a really good example of that in a way. It wasn't completely like the term juvenoia really represents, but it was like a taste of that, seeing this father like not willing to give up on letting his son fulfill his dreams and everything. So
Yeah, that one, the ending I thought was really good, but depending on how you look at it, kind of disturbing.
yeah.
Sometimes the fate of some of these characters it's just like thrown at you like, oh, that's pretty dark. The way the son gets not what he wants, but what he should have, really.
Yep.
Yeah.
Kuttner had this way of writing sort of a funny, light story, and then in the last few pages, really twist it to a dark place.
Yeah.
And I think that's why you're perhaps thinking of it like a Twilight Zone, some of these stories as well. Not just a twist ending, but a turn towards the darkness of what he's talking about.
Right.
Yeah, there's definitely like extra layers written into the really good ones, I think, that make you think about not just the surface of the story, but it gets into some like deeper themes, and in such a short story, I think it's like they're masters at that.
Now, I haven't looked it up, but I'm thinking, wasn't Absalom the son of David in the Bible? And somehow he met a bad end with a tree, I believe.
Yeah, definitely biblical. And
Yeah.
I didn't look in to see if there was parallels to that. I don't remember the story completely, but I'm sure, knowing them, that it is.
Yeah, I would think so.
Okay, Richard, do you have a one you want to talk about?
Well, you know what? I want to see if either of you want to talk about it first. It's Mimsy Were the Borogoves. I had a long conversation with Chris of Liminal Spaces on this one in an episode on his channel. But if either of you were thinking about talking about it, I'd rather hear you do that first, and I'll go to a different one.
It wasn't one of my choices.
Okay.
Even though I think it's the best one.
Yeah, it's one that I read. It was in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, and it's fantastic. It's one of my favorite
It's
short
like
stories
a
of all
cut
time.
above the majority, if not all the others.
Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely is the class of the collection. I don't know. Do you want to say anything else about it, and then I'll just fill in a few key things that we talked about?
Yeah, we could touch on it. Yeah.
Well, Mimsy, very shortly, or a very short, sort of spoiler-free type of one for it, or blurb for it, would be that there's this future person who has invented time travel, and so he's trying to figure out, how am I going to test this time travel? And he's created it like a box he can send back in time that is supposed to return to him. So he takes one and goes, well, I should put something into it, perhaps. I'm not exactly sure how he's thinking this is going to tell him whether it's gone back in time or not, but he puts in, his children have grown up, he puts in some of his children's old toys, and so he sends it back. It doesn't come back. Well, he's got another prototype, so he puts a few more of the toys in there, sends it back. It's not coming back. He forgets the whole experiment, thinks that, oh, okay, I guess it just didn't work. Then we go back in time to 1942, and there's a pair of children, Scott and Emma, I believe their names are. Scott finds this box that's kind of existing almost between a dimension of ours and the place it came from. And so he takes a rock and hammers on it until it comes through completely into our dimension. Takes it home, hides it from his parents to start with, and finds these futuristic toys. And these are toys which are educational style toys. They teach you some things, and they also kind of bring you into the culture that they came from. Now, we don't know exactly if this is a future or another dimension. It's definitely humans who populate that part. And we eventually get to a point where his parents discover it. They get a psychologist involved. Is this something good? Is it changing our children? Then the other box we find out came into the 1800s to this girl who is really good at writing poetry and those sort of things. And the toys and things she finds in there help her to tell stories to her uncle, who happens to be ultimately Lewis Carroll. And so Mimsy were the Borogoves, some people would know as a line from Jabberwocky, which you would find in Alice in the Looking Glass, I believe it is. Now, how do those two stories come together and what happens? That's where I think I'll leave it for you to read if you haven't read it. It's one of the top stories as picked by science fiction authors in 1965 for the previous years, from the Science Fiction Writers of America. So obviously they thought it was great as well. And this was by Lewis Paget. So it was both of them writing this book. I think I'll leave it there so that I don't spoil it, but it's an amazing job of bringing those two worlds together. The idea of educational toys, which would transform the way you even think.
Yeah.
To a
If you're
quality
introduced
that
to it early
yeah,
enough. Yeah.
that was fascinating. And so there's a lot of components here that I found really fascinating. And there's an ending in itself that is interesting for the kids, exciting for the kids, but really dark for the parents.
Yeah. Like that's, again, I was left thinking, oh, just as an aside, you're like, oh, but this person's fate is, really dark. But yeah, I was so disappointed I had already watched your video with liminal spaces before reading it.
Well, if
Because
somebody is curious,
it
they
would have been
can
so
watch
much,
that video.
yeah, it would have
Yeah.
been so much better, but going
I
in,
think-
totally blind. But it was still, yeah, I thought it was a cut above everything else.
And when I first read it years and years ago, I don't think I fully understood the connection with the different timelines. And then I saw your video you did with Chris, and then I reread it carefully, and it's just like a masterpiece, really, for a short story.
Yeah, like it would have been good even without that thread, but like connecting that, it just made it so much better. Really, really good.
Yep.
Mhm.
And the toys were interesting. Like one was like a cube with some little people inside, and the kid slowly realizes like whatever I think they do, kind of thing. So he could kind of like, use his mind to have them build a little society or something and see what happens if he destroys it.
Cause and effect.
Yeah, and the
Yeah.
little girl playing with like a wire toy, but there's like a fourth dimension aspect to it or something was really neat.
Yeah.
And the other toy was like an anatomical doll, but a little different than a modern day human. And the parents are like, "Where'd you get these? Like, what are these?" And I love that he hits it with a rock too.
Yeah,
To
typical
get it
kid.
out. Yeah. Anything else to say about that one?
I think I'll leave it there. I
Okay.
really would like people to
Yeah,
take it in on their own. I think that there's enough that we've given here that they can really enjoy it.
and it's readily available. Like, go read that one, people, if you haven't.
Yeah, I think it's in a lot of anthologies.
I think you can just find it online too.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if this is my favorite, but one that I really enjoyed, and I think I really enjoyed his shorter, or their shorter stories, was a endowment policy, which is takes place in the 40s, and we just have a cab driver named Denny, who's, I guess, not down on his luck, but just not happy with his life. He's in a rut. He's probably going to drive a taxi for life. He's got no real plans or ambition, I don't think. And one rainy night, dispatch gives him a call, and somebody has asked for him specifically to pick him up across town. I think this takes place in New York. And he's like, who who would know me and request me? But he goes, and it's an old man he's never seen before with a bit of a strange accent. And he doesn't really have a destination. He just says, drive over here for now. And the guy's like, hey, how would you like to make $1,000? And Denny's like, suspicious, but he could use the money, so he'll listen. And the guy's like, all I want is a bodyguard for the night. There's some people after me. There's this thing I got to do. It's not a big deal. It probably won't be that dangerous. And if you don't like the sound of it, you can walk with the money. So Denny's like, all right. And the guy mentions, he might be being followed, but Denny's already wise to this. He's noticed there's a taxi following him. And he loses the tail and takes the guy into a bar. They got to kill time because the guy's here to do some sort of task, which involves he's got to go into this house no earlier than 11 p.m. and retrieve a document or a notebook. And he's like, that's all I need you to do. If you'll do it for me and keep me safe in the process. Somehow the tail finds him at the bar, and they evade these guys after a little fist fight in the alley. And he's like, well, let's just go to this place now. Let's break in and I'll get this notebook for you. He's like, no, it's got to be 11 p.m. It can't be any earlier. There's this guy. He's a scientist. He's writing a formula. It won't be done yet. I need it at this exact time. So they wait outside the house. It's storming rain. It's 11 p.m. They're looking in through the basement window. And this guy walks up to this safe. He puts his book in it, and then there's a distraction, and he leaves without locking it. And the old man, who goes by the name of Smith, says, okay, I'm going to cause a distraction in case those guys are out there who are following me. You just run in and grab the book. And sure enough, somebody materializes at the last minute. There's another little scuffle. And this guy beats Denny to the safe. All he does is shut the safe. He doesn't take the book or anything. He just shuts the safe and runs away. And, now there's a fire. The house is burning down. And Denny tries, but he can't get the safe open. And he never gets the book. And he never finds out what it was all about. He never sees Smith again. But there's one final chapter where we get a bit more information as to what was going on. And I thought it was a really cool twist. Because you never know. Stories like this, I think my default is to trust what's happening and maybe not look for ulterior motives. And maybe this guy that Denny interacted with wasn't exactly doing things for the right reason kind of thing. I love the mystery of it, and I love the turn at the end, the switch. I'd love to spoil it, but I mean, I'd love to do that for all of them.
Well, it was an unexpected trope of science fiction that came up, and it was also there was a couple of unexpected reveals, and
Yeah,
the story completely made sense after those happened.
yeah, and Smith and the people tailing him, their situation is left ambiguous as to, where they're from and what they're about. I couldn't really tell if Smith was trying to do something that would have ultimately been good, or if he really was just selfish trying to use Denny. It's hard to say more.
It's one of those ones too, after you see what happens. I went back and read some parts over again, and it's one of those ones they put these stories together so well. There's no loose ends really. It's all tied up really good, and it all makes sense.
And very short. Like it was just perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Had that noir touch kind of taking place in the 40s.
And once again, it was a kind of a dark reveal that happened at the end.
Yeah. I guess I'll leave it at that. Ira, do you have another?
Yeah. So the story Two-Handed Engine came out in 1955, and I always knew about this one because when I was collecting books before, Centipede Press did a collection of stories with both authors, C.L. Moore and Henry Kuttner, and they reused the Richard Powers cover on the front of it. You could go look it up. I got a different book recently that had that same artwork, so they reused it for this special press edition. And I knew nothing about him at the time, but it always intrigued me. And so this story is about in a future where there's not really much punishable crime, really, except for murder. And if you murder someone, like, you're always being watched, you're always going to get caught. But what happens is these robots just start following the murderer around, and they could just follow him around. It's kind of indeterminate time. You're never really told. There's no set timeline that they're going to punish him at some point, but it ends up driving most of these people insane, basically being followed by this robot, knowing that they're kind of caught. And so this is another really good one where we have someone who supposedly figured out a way around this, and he gets another person, the main character in our story, to commit a murder, saying, "Hey, I got you covered. Don't worry. You know, I have a way to get around this." And he tries to prove it to him, and he gives him a big sum of money. And so this guy ends up committing a murder, and sure enough, a robot starts following him around, and he's thinking, was I set up? What's going on here? He finally gets to confront the guy who gave him the money and everything. And the ending in this one is pretty interesting. I don't want to spoil too much of this one because it was one of my favorite ones, but this society has kind of gotten rid of guilt in a way. These robots are almost a metaphor of this guilt following you around, and it's apparent, everyone can see it. And so there's kind of a twist at the end, kind of a turn. And the more I thought about it, it could be a good thing. Initially, I thought it was a bad ending, but in the end, I think it was actually a good ending. So it was just very intricate ending in this one that I loved.
See, the first few stories I read like almost a month ago, so I skimmed through them today, and it was on the second read that I had the same conclusion. I was like, actually, this might not be a bad ending after all.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that was really cool. I also loved how smug he was at the restaurant in the opening. Like, I got away with it. I got all this money.
Mm-hmm.
And then you hear the footsteps and you see the robot enter, and he's like, oh, somebody's about to get served their notice that they've been caught. And of course, it walks up to him.
Yeah, that was great.
It was just so ominous, this robot marching into this restaurant.
Yeah.
It's giant, and it has like a mirror-like face, and it stopped at his table when everybody else is like, as soon as this robot passes by them, they're like, whew, it's not me.
Yeah. Which I was like, well, why do they feel guilty? I guess maybe the fear of mistakenly being accused.
Yeah.
Because you don't
like
want one of these
when the
things.
principal would walk through a classroom, like you'd be almost worried.
Yeah.
That, did I do something wrong?
Anything, but yeah.
And it's such a public thing, and it won't go away. So it's yeah. Very interesting story, though.
There's a couple funny ones. I don't think I'll talk about them specifically. I just got to mention them before I get to the one that I'd like to talk about. I found the misguided halo very funny.
Yeah.
And it's pretty much as it sounds. An angel gives the wrong person a halo, and what does that happens to that person as they live with this halo that actually physically is present for that person. Another one is called Exit the Professor, and there's actually a sequel later in the book, and it's about mutants that have lived a long time and are living in the I'm not sure if it's the Ozarks, but down in southern United States in hill country, and they're trying to hide basically from society.
Mm.
But the one that was kind of weird and funny as well that I want to talk about is called the Twonky.
Yeah, that was going to be
Had a-
my choice. Yeah.
oh, that's your choice?
Yeah.
Okay, you know what?
Oh, you can go for it. It's a good one.
Okay. It's a bad name. I don't like the Twonky. I wish it had a better name to it.
Yeah.
But there's a guy who has amnesia who's all of a sudden plopped into this situation where he's in a barn of sorts or a manufacturing location of sorts, and he's told you got to make this, and really it looks like it's a old hi-fi record player that he's supposed to make. And so he goes, okay, I think I know how to do this, and he scrounges parts here and there, puts them together, and he makes one. Hand makes it, and it resembles this Twonky is what the name of this hi-fi is. And then he's starting to gain his memory again. He strips out of his clothes in the corner of this building and feels to a place where there's sort of like this invisible chair, gets on it and disappears. He's gone. That's it for him in this story. Next, we go to the next scene. We find a couple who've purchased this Twonky, believing it to be this hi-fi player that they're going to have in their house. And as it's put into place in their house, strange things start to happen. At first to the husband. He takes out a cigarette. All of a sudden, a tentacle comes out from this hi-fi player with a cigarette lighter and lights a cigarette for him. And it talks to him. And we discover that this person, potentially from the future, has created really a robot, but it all seems quirky and funny, but it turns dark.
Yeah.
This robot has some sort of agenda built into it as well that really makes it something that is ominous and foreboding, and some bad things happen.
Yeah, the starting was just like Mimsy Where the Bora Grows, really, where we get a snapshot of something from the future affecting the past, and then it's done and you never hear about it again, which I thought was pretty neat. But this is the one that really had me thinking, boy, that was a dark ending.
Yeah.
And you never, it's quite the mystery. Like, what is this thing? Like, this guy from the future obviously works in a factory, I think, making these things. And when he appears in modern day, radio factory, since he has amnesia, he kind of knows what to do. He makes what he's used to making, but he makes it look like what these people are making, which is this radio thing. And then you never really know, like, what is this thing's rules? Like, why it'll let the new owner read certain things or listen to certain music, but not other things. And it also does chores.
And it eventually makes you start to wonder about what is that future that person came from.
Yeah.
Because of the
it seems
structure bleak that it has within itself in terms of how it treats the humans here in this present day.
Yeah. It's there's a lot left unsaid, kind of like what was it? The one I mentioned, the endowment policy, where there's a glimpse of something and you're kind of like, well, what's that world about? You really don't know what this thing is. And it's a funny story at first.
Part of me is always like, in stories like this could have been a short novel or something bigger, but I kind of like it left to the reader a little bit. Some of that stuff's unknown and you kind of have to fill in the gaps, and almost like you get to participate in the story.
The guy's friend, who's like a professor, I think, he's like theorizes that whatever it is, its job is to destroy initiative. So it's like, okay, well, what kind of future is this, or alternate timeline, or what? Yeah, he calls it a monitor and a sensor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with Ira, though. I do like short stories that leave you thinking, that they don't lay everything out and that they haven't expanded these things. Um, yeah, idea is the king of short stories, really. Uh,
Yeah.
and there's no
Well said.
shortage of those kinds of ideas here. I would say that I'm not always satisfied with his short stories. There were some that were just kind of okay, but there's
Yeah.
plenty that were great,
Yeah.
that are fun to read.
There's a few that I didn't really care for.
There was the one, I forget which one, that actually had chapters in it, and it was like
Mhm.
that story couldn't decide if it was a short story or a novel, and it didn't work, I think, in the length that he wrote it in.
The Big
It just
Night, I think it
yeah,
was. Yeah.
yeah. I didn't care for that one much. That was the
Um,
Laku Karacha ship.
Yes. That was the name of the ship.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I liked the idea and the theme.
Yeah.
You know, that it was like a hyper ship, but this technology was kind of being phased out for instant matter transport. But yeah, it was too long. um, Although it did have some great metaphors for the universe being an ocean and washing up on the shores of solar systems and extinguishing suns across time, which I thought, wow, that was cool. That should be in a better written story.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking. That one, I think, should have been maybe a longer story and really get into
Yeah,
it or something.
it had
But
a lot of. That was one I was kind of maybe thinking of talking about. It had like the philosophical alien pilot
yeah,
that knew to the minute when he was going to die, sort of thing. And since he's long lived, he could kind of see the fallacy of human endeavor, I guess, or something like that. Uh, Now, I did notice something that came up when we were reading The Best of Elsbreg de Camp. Do you guys remember the story 2 Yards of Dragon and how it
yeah,
had an ending very similar to a Monty Python sketch?
yeah.
Well, in this collection, we have a story called Nothing But Gingerbread Left,
Mhm.
which is a very short story about a university professor and one of his students who come up with an idea of um, coming up with a phrase or a rhyme that is so addictive and gets stuck in your head that it'll distract you and maybe even drive you nuts. And they use this against the German army, military, and basically win the war.
In World War II.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I thought, hold on. I've seen Monty Python do a sketch of the funniest joke ever written, and they use that to kill all the Germans. In this case, it's obvious which came first. Last time we had to do a little research, but I looked that sketch up and rewatched it because I've seen it. You know, it must have been like 20 years ago, and I've never forgotten it because the guy who wrote the joke was named Ernest Scribbler, and I just thought, what a name. But yeah, it was like the same thing.
And this was obviously first, right? It's 1943.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Well, it's before the end of the war, so
yeah,
it didn't have the benefit of understanding how the war ended at this point.
True. Yeah.
yeah. That one was interesting. I liked it. That was a shorter one too, if I remember right.
Yeah, it was very short.
Very short.
And I've noticed a lot of these authors, like Fritz Leiber and Frederick Brown, kind of veer into like what I guess we'd call today like urban fantasy stories. And one that I really enjoyed from Kuttner was Housing Problem, which was also fairly short, about this couple. Also during wartime, like they work in a factory for the war effort. To make a little extra money, they have a tenant who rents out a room. It's this old Mr. Henchard. And they make note that he's like an abnormally lucky guy, especially like if you're with him, some of that good luck rubs off on you. And the only weird thing about him is he's got a bird cage, which he always has a cover on it. They never get a glimpse of it, whether they're looking outside through the window or like when they go in to clean the room, the thing's always covering it. And there's just lots of strange noises that come from it. So this married couple theorizes like, oh, it's a canary. And no, it's two of this species. And the story kicks off when the tenant reveals that he's got to leave town for a week. And you can clean the room, but don't look in my birdcage. Just the strangest demand. He's very angry about it. I know you're curious. I know you've been curious, but don't lift up that curtain and don't look at my birdcage. And of course, they take a peek. I mean, we could spoil. It's such a simple, short story, but I thought it was.
I think you could spoil this one.
Yeah, like what a creative idea. They open it up and it's a miniature house inside. But they still can't see what lives inside because every time they take a peek, the shutters close, the front door closes. And they're like, is it a bird in there? Is it some kind of creature? And every day they take a peek while Mr. Henchard is gone.
They're hearing little noises.
Yeah, there's weird noises. There's milk being delivered. There's newspapers being delivered.
Purple milk.
Yeah.
Lights turn on and off.
Yeah. Headlines on the newspaper that don't make any sense.
Yeah.
I liked it. It was a good one. I don't know if you want to go a little further as to what was going on, but I thought, what a great idea.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the original renter, when he comes back home, I thought he was hilarious in the way he got angry with them too.
Yeah.
The language he used.
Oh yeah, he's always saying
claptrap, I think.
Yeah. He might have even done a tut-tut. There was definitely one tut-tut in this collection.
But inadvertently, he reveals the source of his good luck, and then he moves on. And our married couple kind of has some of that good luck rub off. Although even the punchline was like, it's not as good of a good luck, and the reason why I thought was kind of funny.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any other stories you guys want to?
Well, I think we gotta talk about this.
I was just gonna say, I think there's 5 stories involving the main character.
This has got to be the Proud Robot, right?
Exactly.
I mean, it's got to be the Proud Robot, and
yeah,
I would say it's a very comedic story. It has a funny punchline. It's kind of like this inventor who's always drunk. He invents this robot, but he can't even remember why. I won't spoil it. It's a pretty short one. There's other layers though in this story besides the punchline. That's what I think. Like when we were reading like Frederick Brown or Elsbreg de Camp, and you get those stories, it's just a joke basically. This one has an awesome joke in it, but there's also a little bit more to it than that.
Yeah, you'll have to help me out because that's one of the early stories, and I don't remember much. But I do know it was like a popular character of his that spawned several stories.
Well, the robot was so proud that it always kept looking at itself in the mirror and talking about how perfect it was.
Yes, how wonderful it was.
Yeah.
How lucky.
Yeah, and the inventor is asking him why I created you, and he wouldn't tell him.
Yeah.
And then, the inventor was asked to help this like TV company get a one-up on a competing television company because they had this technology that was like this big screen and all this kind of stuff. So, he there's that part of the plot too, which is kind of funny and engaging and kind of satirical in ways too. But this whole storyline with the robot and what ends up, the reason he invented this is hilarious. I thought.
I do remember that part.
Sometimes I wonder, it's an interesting story, but I don't think it's the best stories. One of the best stories in here. And sometimes I wonder about the choices that they've made in all of these books here about the story that garners the cover image.
Yeah.
I don't think they always pick the best story for it.
No, I don't know.
Or they just give the artist reign. I don't know.
Does any of this correspond to anything really?
I don't think so.
I didn't really.
I couldn't pinpoint it. I mean, there was definitely drinking in space in some of these, but
well, it's as weird a choice as the Best of Fritz Leiber, because that was one of the shortest. Nothing much to say about that story, and yet it got the cover art.
Now, to credit it, in the paperbacks here, they are images of stories. It's just the pick of which story they choose
Yeah.
to use as an image is the
I do
strange
applaud,
thing.
depicting an actual story. Even the best of Raymond Galoon, like that is one of the stories, but
but not
it
my
was just
favorite.
nowhere near.
Yeah, could you imagine Mimsy were the Borogroves as a cover?
Yeah.
With those kids playing with some toys and dimensions.
Yeah. That I could see.
Or even that robot story you were talking about. The what was it? The engine, two-headed engine. Yeah.
I mean, there could have been worse choices, like a gnome. There was.
Oh,
that was
I
a
didn't
short
like that
one.
story.
No, I didn't like it, but again, it had a character meeting a terrible end.
True.
Well, and
no, did he?
Yep.
Okay, well, we'll talk about that later. I thought that there was a little bit of a positive ending for him.
For a
so
gnome, there was.
That's the one where the guy he's a union organizer.
Yeah.
And he goes, yeah. I thought that one was funny because it was very satirical, and I just got off a very satirical book. It kind of reminded me of that, but it was very absurd and kind of ridiculous.
Yeah. There was a better union story in here, if you guys remember.
Yeah. Yeah.
What else? The Iron Standard was okay. It was kind of a glimpse into some of the like old, I guess not really space opera-ish, but more science fiction. Here we have a spaceship exploring a planet kind of thing, with some stranded astronauts. Kind of a first contact attempt with Venusians, and these 4 astronauts. Now they're stuck on Venus, but I don't remember there actually being a reason why they couldn't leave. The main problem is they're running out of food. Maybe they can't make the return journey to Earth or something. But the Venusians are very much like human, like society, but their culture has kind of stagnated. And once the humans' food starts running out, the Venusians won't give them any of their own. They're like, oh, you have to make money to you got to contribute to society to get something. But you can't work unless you're in a guild, and you have to pay to get in a guild, and you don't have any money. So they're stuck in a catch-22, and they come up with a ridiculous plot after some failed attempts to, how can we make money, or how can we get food? How can we survive? Because these guys are willing to just let us starve, kind of thing.
That one had some satire in it too.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And just
that was probably the most political of the stories, and it was about they had to find some sort of a solution to break down the political blockade that they were facing in terms of being able to get food.
Yeah, just the most ridiculous scenario.
how to break into their economic system.
Yeah,
basically.
Yeah, I forget.
Yeah.
They determined that was the way to do it. They'd have to screw with the economy, sort of thing.
They had to create something that had a factor of desirability so that they would find a way to get around the system, that they would they could live without what they had.
One of the better stories we haven't mentioned yet is What You Need, which spawned a Twilight Zone episode. Did you want to talk about that one?
Well, that is the one we were talking about right at the beginning. A store has actually backwards a sign on the window that says, we have what you need, and it's backwards. So this reporter is going, what is this about? And goes into the store to try and find out. And so we find out the owner can see it. He said, I've been living for years seeing it the other way. I thought I should see it here. I'm the one who sees it the most. I should see it the way I can see it. Which doesn't have a lot to do with the story, but is just an interesting, quirky quality to it.
Yeah.
But what if a person, after a while, a store owner could know exactly what that person needed, and that item that they needed was something that seemed absurd, but then something happened within the next day, week, month, that item was exactly what they needed. to rescue themselves from a bad situation. And so the reporter buys into it just to see what happens, has an experience, and then wants to go back and explore more about what's happening. But there is a very dark turn to how the store owner learns about what people need and the store owner's motives and driving force behind what he does.
Yeah, part of that, remember the Philip K. Dick story where they had all the trinkets the guy had given himself so that he was ready for him, and they seemed like odd things, but that sort of reminded me of that part, that little part in this one.
Yeah, very intriguing because he's watching other customers come in and leave with I can't remember examples now, say a shoe or something, and he's like, what, like, I know that person, they're very wealthy, like what is it you sell? But he won't tell him. He'll only let him experience it, I guess, see for himself. And
many of his customers are very wealthy, and so he gives this guy a deal according to his salary to be able to experience this.
Yeah, and again, very dark twist for one of our characters.
Yeah.
I think we've discussed almost every story. There was The Voice of the Lobster, which I did not enjoy.
I did not either.
No? Okay, good.
It had a really good footnote, though.
I agree. The footnotes were the funniest part of the story.
Yeah. Which gives, it's kind of, I could read it. It gives you a little bit of the some of the humor that's thrown in. It's not like over the top.
Sure.
And this is the only story that has footnotes, just for the people who are watching.
Yeah, and I don't know how much setup I want to give, but the inhabitants of Ceres were long supposed to be invisible. Lately, it had been discovered that Ceres had no inhabitants.
Yeah.
And it's a footnote to a snarky comment about whether that person was Syrian or whatever they called it.
Yeah. That's your first assumption that, hey, they must be invisible.
I think there was another footnote where the main character, who's a swindler, had once sold the earth to some people. Something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that footnote, that was probably the only laugh out loud moment. Like, I rarely laugh when I read, but I thought, wow, that's so ridiculous. I could just see Kuttner or anybody writing that and then smiling to themselves, like, yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
I will say, Kuttner was not exactly what I expected. I'm curious to read some longer stuff. Like, I've got a bunch of his Ace novels, which, are like a novella length. I'm quite curious to try those, but probably I'm going to read Fury, or I'm pretty sure my hazy memory says there is a prequel, but I think he wrote Fury first. But I know he's well known for this.
Mm-hmm.
I know we already explained or mentioned it. Have you guys read much else by him? Like, whether it's short or long?
So I just read Fury, and then what I would say is, and the only reason it didn't show up in here, and it didn't show up in C.L. Moore's either, but the story Private Eye is amazing. And they wrote it under Lewis Paget. It's one of my favorite short stories of all time, pretty much. It's right up there with Mimsy, Where the Boar Goes. It's really good. And I don't think it was in the C.L. Moore one. I can't remember, but look for that one.
In the best of? Yeah,
the best.
It's not in the best of.
Okay.
I'm intrigued. And I have confirmed in this short story collection, there's a prequel to Fury.
Oh.
It might be the title story. I'm not sure, but something in here is a prequel of sorts.
A short story that prequels it? Is that what? Yeah. Or is it a novel?
No, it's a short story.
Oh, okay.
The prequel to Kuttner's classic novel Fury, an enthralling story. Blah blah blah. Yeah. See, I bought this and I thought it was a novel, and I thought it was the prequel. But then on the back it says, "In these 5 gems, you'll see the talents of Kuttner and more." So, 5 short stories.
makes me very interested to read the Best of C.L. Moore as well, just
Oh,
to
I
see
can't
if
wait.
there's a bit of a difference here in terms of if she's writing on her own. I'd want to first figure out, and
Yeah.
can you tell?
See, now I'm gonna have to. I don't know. I'd have to go back. I will say the quality of the prose is a whole nother level than most authors. So that tells me the majority of the stories in the C.L. Moore must be just her.
Mm-hmm.
Weren't you reading an anthology that had vintage season in it? Did you get to that yet?
No, I didn't. I don't remember reading that one.
I read that one when I did that video about those short stories that Barry Milesburg recommended.
Mm-hmm.
He
Okay.
recommended Vintage Season and Private Eye from these two, and they were some of my favorites out of the 10.
Yeah, vintage season's probably like the Mimsy were the Borogroves of that collection.
Yeah.
Where
Yeah,
did you
it's
read
really good.
Private Eye?
Private Eye.
But where did you read it?
I was just looking for that. I'll have to pull it up. I definitely went to ISFDB and looked, and I had to go find anthology that it was in. There was a few options, but I found one that I could get it in.
There's a number of places that actually print out the old magazines, and so you can actually, well, not print out. They scan the old magazines, so you can actually read them from old magazines too. Archive.org would be one of the places that does that. So there's a chance that we could probably find some of these stories if we want to look at them individually from those spots as well online.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've been getting a collection of PDFs of some of the old magazines because they're hard to find. They're expensive. If you want like old Astounding and Strange Tales and all those, I mean, you're not going to find them. Let's see.
I was just checking my collections, but I don't have it. I've got a couple Kuttner collections, but
yeah, it was written under the Lewis Paget when it came out.
Okay.
And even in the collection I got it in, it was listed as Lewis Paget.
So I wonder.
Oh, by the way, that was their paternal and maternal grandmother last names.
Yeah.
That Lewis was, I'm not sure if it was his grandmother, and then Paget was the other grandmother. And so that's how that name came to be.
Yeah, I like if you're going to have a pseudonym, have it mean something or come from something.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it was in this one. It was in this, The Mirror of Infinity by Robert Silverberg. And this was really cool because each story has an introduction by a different author. You probably won't be able to see it.
Oh, cool.
But it had a forward. That one had a forward by James Blish. And I think what he said in there was, Campbell said that you could never write like a good murder mystery or detective science fiction story because you would have enough technology to figure out anything. And so the Kuttners were like, okay, game on, you know? And they wrote this awesome story about, it's basically kind of this murder mystery.
Oh yeah, I'll be tracking that down.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Well, I think we've discussed just about everything, which leaves just one thing on our agenda, which would be our next pick, and that would be Ira's Choice.
Yep.
So there's 21, and we've read 8. I've read 10.
So I thought about just going straight into C.L. Moore. But I thought I'd give us a break, and I'm going with The Best of C.M. Kornbluth.
Right on.
Also have that one.
Right there.
Yeah. There we go.
Yes, this will be very intriguing.
Yeah.
So he wrote a lot with Frederick Pohl. I think I've read maybe something from him, but I recently read The Space Merchants that they co-wrote together, and I really enjoyed it. And I think this might be a little different. It's got the story The Marching Morons in it that I've always wanted to read, and some
Does
other
it have
ones.
The Black Bag as well?
The Black Bag?
The Black Bag, yeah.
The Little Black Bag, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh,
yeah, it's in here.
That's a classic, that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Marching Morons is good too. I've read a
Yep.
couple of these from just different anthologies.
The
So
Little Black
another,
Bag was in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, I think, right?
The Little Black Bag, I believe, was in there.
Yeah.
another author who died young.
Yes, very young.
Yeah, and he didn't brush his teeth.
I remember reading that somewhere.
And you know, I don't want to like get too deep into it, but it's like that had to have contributed to his heart attack, like having bad like
Quite possibly, yeah.
gingivitis and everything else. Like,
Because I think he was in his 30s when he passed away.
he was pretty young, 30s or 40s. I can't
I can't
remember.
remember. You know, we'll eventually get to the best of Stanley G. Weinbaum, who also died young in his 30s. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I remember reading that about Kornbluth. I really like reading about, you know, these authors talking about one another. Looks like the intro is Frederick Pohl on this one.
Yep.
Makes sense. They
Yeah.
team together quite often.
Yeah.
I forget who it was that did the intro to Elsberg de Camp, how they mentioned him just sitting in the back of a room taking notes about people talking. Like, I love learning stuff like that about these authors.
Yeah. Well, you know, the 1970s was that prime time to be able to get those great introductions, or even Phil K. Dick gives his afterword to the whole thing.
Yeah.
You know, a number of the people were alive, or at least their contemporaries were still alive.
That's a treat. Yeah.
All right. Well, that was fun. That was number 8. So our 9th discussion will be on Ira's channel at some time in the future. Henry Kuttner.
Yep. And that was a good one. Even though they weren't all my favorite, there was some just top tier stories in there.
I'd say I went in with too high expectations, I think. But the stories that were really good made it worthwhile. I'm still curious about Kuttner. I feel like I need to keep exploring him, read some of his longer works, some of his novels and stuff.
Yeah, and like with some of his horror, he was writing some of the like Lovecraftian stuff. I didn't even know that until recently.
Yeah. Didn't Bradbury say he kind of was imitating other writers to start with, and then he found his own voice, or he found a wife who helped him find his own voice?
Yeah. He also gave some recommendations to Bradbury of authors to check out who were, for the most part, new to me, which was Catherine Ann Porter, Eudora Welty, John Collier. Did Ira just recently read a collection of his?
Yeah.
Collier, I think I've read a story or two from.
And Thorne Smith, who I have heard of, but I thought, oh man, you know, one author recommending others authors to Bradbury, like I got to check those people out.
Yeah. Yeah, the Collier book, it's the best of John Collier from Pocket Books, and I read that, and I still haven't done a video on it. There's a couple of them that I think I want to reread. It took me so long to get through them that it's like a 500-page book, but I think there was like 1,000 stories in it. There was a lot of very, very short stories, and they just like kind of.
Did Pocket Books do a large amount of best ofs?
Yeah, I've got them all now. I think they did like 8 or 9, somewhere around there. Okay. And they did people like Silverberg, who
I would love to have that. Yeah.
Yeah, who I would have said like I would love to seen his best of, and Damon Knight and a bunch of other big ones. So.
Oh yeah, I've got the book club edition of Damon Knight.
Walter M. Miller Jr.
When we finish this series, just keep going with best ofs.
Yeah.
You know, everybody.
Yeah.
Actually, Walter M. Miller Jr., those are some good stories there in the best.
Well, I got to reacquire that. I gave that to you.
That's right. You did. Thank you.
Yeah. But yeah. I don't know.
got rid of a couple paperbacks because I got that hardcover from you.
Yeah. I just, this whole project has made me realize that a best of collection, well, not a best of, just a collection of short stories is a great way to introduce you to an author that you know nothing about.
Yeah.
Because every experience so far has been awesome.
Totally.
But yeah, I guess we'll leave it there. Thank you guys for joining me. And as always, we'll be back in a month or month and a half or so on Ira's channel with the best of Corn Bluth.
Yep.
Looking forward to it.
All right.
Thanks,
for
Matt.
joining me.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, everybody, for watching.
Thank you.